The silence in the room was a physical thing. It pressed in on my ears, heavier than the humid Mumbai air that seeped through the window frames of the conservatory hall. My bow trembled, a millimeter above the strings of the violin. My left hand, slick with sweat, felt alien on the neck of the instrument. 3 faces stared at me from behind a long table. The jury. Their expressions weren't cruel, just blank, which was somehow worse. My piece was a complex raga. One I'd practiced until my fingers were calloused and my dreams were filled with its melody. But the violin in my hands, a standard German-made instrument, felt like a stranger. It couldn't bend the notes the way I heard them in my head. It couldn't weep. It could only produce a clean, sterile Western sound. The microtones, the delicate slides that were the soul of the music, came out as clumsy, out-of-tune squeals. I'd started strong, but halfway through, the disconnect between the music in my heart and the sound in the air became a chasm I couldn't cross. My fingers fumbled. A note screeched. The rhythm, once a steady pulse inside me, shattered. And now, silence. "Mr. Joshi," one of the judges said, his voice soft but final. I lowered the violin. I couldn't look at them. I could only look at the polished floor, where my reflection was a blurry, shameful smudge. I had failed, not just an exam, but something deeper. I had failed the music itself. The walk home was a blur of honking rickshaws and the press of the evening crowds. When I opened the door to our small flat in Dadar, the smell of frying onions and my mother's worry met me at the door. My father was sitting at the dining table, reading the newspaper. My uncle Ravi was there too, sipping chai. "So?" my father asked, not looking up from his paper. I didn't have to say a word. My mother's hand went to her heart. Ravi uncle let out a small, knowing smirk. "I told you," Ravi said, stirring his tea loudly. "All this time with the bowing and scraping. He should have studied engineering like my Samir. A secure job, a future." "Ravi, please," my mother whispered. But my father folded his newspaper with a sharp crack. He was a practical man, the senior clerk who had worked his entire life to give me and my sister a respectable middle-class existence. Music to him was a hobby, not a profession. My failure confirmed his deepest fears. "It's over," he said. The words were flat, an edict. "No more lessons. You will enroll in commerce classes. Get a degree, a real one." That night, lying on my narrow bed, listening to the city that never slept, I felt a grief so profound it was like a physical weight on my chest. The dream of being a violinist was dead. But as the hours passed, something else began to surface through the grief. A strange clarity. The problem wasn't my fingers. It wasn't my ear. It was the tool. The violin itself was a foreign language trying to speak my mother tongue. It couldn't capture the soul of our music. The next morning, I told them, "I'm not going to Commerce College," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "I'm going to learn to make violins." Ravi uncle, who was there again, actually choked on his toast. My father saw it as a final act of defiance, a rejection of the life he had so carefully planned for me. In his eyes, I was choosing a life of poverty and shame. He gave me an ultimatum: the commerce degree, or his door would be closed to me. I packed a small bag that night. My mother slipped me a wad of rupee notes, her eyes full of tears. "Be safe, beta," she whispered, her hand trembling as she touched my cheek. My father didn't come out of his room. I took a train south, away from the noise and judgment. I had heard whispers of an old man, a Mr. Eapen, who lived in a small coastal town in Kerala. They said he was a master luthier, a recluse who had trained in Italy decades ago and now lived a quiet life, making cellos for a handful of clients. Finding him was an ordeal. When I finally stood before his dusty, single-room workshop, which smelled richly of aged wood and strange sweet resins. He looked at me over his spectacles and shook his head. "I don't take students," he said, his voice raspy. I stayed. I slept on the porch of the closed-down shop next door. For 3 days, I just watched him through the open doorway. I watched the way his hands, gnarled with age, moved with impossible grace over a piece of maple, the way he held a finished cello up to the light, turning it as if it were a precious jewel. On the 4th day, he sighed, a long, weary sound, and pointed to a broom. "The floor is a disgrace," he said. That was the beginning. My life shrunk to the 4 walls of that workshop. My days were filled with the scent of spruce and maple, the scrape of a plane, the sting of varnish in my nostrils. Mr. Eapen was a man of few words. He taught by doing. He would hand me a block of wood. "Feel the grain," he'd say. "It tells you how it wants to be shaped." He never praised me. The closest I got was a grunt that meant acceptable. I swept floors, sharpened tools, and learned the brutal patience of the craft. I learned that a millimeter's mistake could ruin a month of work. I learned that the secret to the sound wasn't just in the shape, but in the thickness of the wood, the arch of the belly, the precise composition of the varnish cooked in a pot over a small flame. My money ran out. I ate 1 meal a day. I wrote letters to my mother, careful not to reveal how much I was struggling. I never heard back from my father. The loneliness was a constant ache, but the work filled the void. The struggle wasn't a punishment, it was a purification. It burned away my ego, my ambition for the stage, and left only the pure, obsessive love for the instrument itself. After 2 years, Mr. Eapen let me work on my first violin. I wanted to use Indian wood. He was skeptical. Stradivari used alpine spruce, he'd grumble. Stradivari didn't have to play a raga, I'd reply. I experimented with Himalayan spruce for the top plate and red cedar for the back and ribs. I changed the angle of the bass bar inside, trying to create a deeper, more resonant chamber that could sustain the long, wavering notes of Indian classical music. My first 3 violins were failures. They were dead things, beautiful wooden boxes with no soul. Ravi Arkel's mocking words echoed in my ears. I nearly gave up. "You are listening with your memory, Mr. Eapen told me one evening, seeing my despair. "You remember what a violin is supposed to sound like. Forget it. Listen to the wood. It has its own zone." That was the key. I stopped trying to build a better European violin. I started trying to build an Indian one. I spent another year on the 4th violin. I worked in a trance, following the grain, my hands seeming to know what to do before my mind did. When I strung it up and drew the bow across the strings for the first time, the sound that emerged startled me. It was warm, deep, and impossibly resonant. It had a voice that was both familiar and utterly new. When I played a simple scale, bending the notes, it didn't squeal. It sang. It wept. Mr. Eapen came over, took it from my hands, and played a short, simple melody. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, he looked at me, and for the first time, he smiled. "Yes," he said, "this one has a voice." I stayed with him for 2 more years, perfecting my craft. I built 6 more violins, each one a little different, each one teaching me something new. I sold one to a local musician. He told another. Word began to travel in small circles. A blog post was written. A critic from Chennai came to see me. He wrote a column, calling my work a reinvention of a Western classic for an Eastern soul. The real breakthrough came a year later. A call from an assistant to Anoushka Sharma, the globally renowned violinist, a woman who played in concert halls from New York to Vienna. She had read the article. She was intrigued. She wanted to commission an instrument. It took me 6 months to build her violin. It was the culmination of everything I had learned, every failure, every small success. I poured all my sweat, my loneliness, and my hope into that piece of wood. I flew to Delhi to deliver it myself. She met me in a rehearsal studio, a small, intense woman with fire in her eyes. She took the violin, examined it silently for a long time, and then she began to play. She didn't play Bach or Mozart. She played a haunting alap, a slow, improvisational piece that explored the deepest corners of a raga. The violin under her chin didn't just produce notes. It produced emotion. It thrummed with a power that filled the room. A sound that was at once as old as the hills and as new as the morning. When she finished, there were tears in her eyes. "It's alive," she whispered. "It breathes." 7 years since I walked out of my father's flat. The call that brought me back was from my cousin's wedding. My mother's voice on the phone was hesitant. "Please come, Rohan. It's your sister's son. The family will be there." She didn't have to say the rest. "Your father will be there." I took the train back to Mumbai. The city assaulted my senses, the same chaotic, vibrant, overwhelming place I had left. Our flat was the same, only smaller than I remembered. My mother hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. My sister cried. My father stood in the doorway of his room, his face an unreadable mask. He looked older. He nodded at me, a stiff, formal gesture. "You are looking well," he said, as if I'd returned from a long illness. Ravi uncle was there, of course, larger and louder than ever. "Ah, the car